I'll be your moderator for our very first workshop of SUNYLA 2021. Woo! All right, so presenters, are you ready? All right, cool. I will introduce you all. So when I say your name, just give a little wave. Don Simmons Jr. from SUNY Westchester Community College. Don Simmons Jr. is the Information Literacy Librarian at SUNY Westchester Community College. Prior to working at Westchester Community College, he served as the Community Engagement Librarian at the White Plains Public Library. Don attended Syracuse University as a scholarship athlete, playing football from 2011 to 2016. As a reminder, this is the critical information literacy steps towards becoming anti-racist in our libraries workshop, so make sure you're in the right place. Our next presenter is Becky Leathersich. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, Becky. She is from SUNY Geneseo and a research instruction librarian and liaison to the School of Education and the Department of Psychology. She is a member of the library and campus's diversity committees. Prior to working at SUNY Geneseo, she was a school librarian. Becky is an alumni of SUNY Geneseo and Syracuse University. Megan Benson is from Binghamton University. Megan is the lead instructor and outreach librarian at Binghamton, where she manages at Bing U libraries. She also has a master's degree in history from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Prior to becoming a librarian, Megan taught Western Civ 1 and 2 at Valencia College in Orlando, Florida. Brandon West, he is also from SUNY Geneseo. Brandon is the head of research instruction services and liaison to anthropology and sociology. His research interests include examining the intersections of information literacy and online learning, applying instructional design principles to enhance student learning, and addressing LGBTQ+ issues in libraries. He has published 2 books through ACRL publications, most recently Creative Instructional Design Practical Applications for Librarians, an edited volume. Fatoma Rad is from Farmingdale State College. She is the acquisitions librarian at Farmingdale State College. She oversees the library liaison program, is the head of the collection development committee, and manages the library's social media accounts. And last but not least, Holly Kuhl from Cayuga Community College. She is the instruction and assessment librarian at Cayuga in Auburn, New York. She coordinates the library's information literacy program, is the library's liaison to the Office of Distance Learning, and is leading an initiative to assess information literacy skills acquisition across all campus programs. Holly completed her MLIS at McGill University's School of Information Studies and is currently pursuing her PhD in history at Syracuse University, where her research focuses on knowledge and information policies in 18th century France. Welcome, everybody, and I'll turn it over to you all.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Holly, would you share a presentation?
Sure. Let me go ahead and make sure. Okay. Am I sharing? Can we all see?
Yeah.
All right. Gonna go into presentation mode. Whoop. That's that. There we are. There's us.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending one of the first sessions of the day of the SUNYLA 2021 conference. As Amanda said, introduced all of us. I'm Brandon West. I'm the chair of SILC, or the SUNYLA Information Literacy Committee. And, you know, one of our focuses in this past year has really been trying to increase our understanding of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also look at what does it actually mean to be anti-racist in our libraries. And in this past year, SILC held both a book club in the fall where we read So You Want to Talk About Race by an author whose last name is Oluo. And then in this past spring, we held a 3-part anti-racism workshop series, and we'll provide links to all of those sessions. They've been recorded for you. And so anyways, one of the big questions that kind of has driven our work is just like how, you know, we all, you know, we've all read the articles, we all attend all these great sessions, but at the end of the day, one of the things I'm always questioning is like, how do we start putting things into practice, right? because it's always much more difficult. It's very easy to read stuff, say, yep, that sounds great. Yep, racism is bad. But then there's the reality of what happens in our libraries. And so I'm hoping that what we're trying to accomplish on this committee is, through the lens of information literacy, if we find our own way that we can kind of become more anti-racist, because I feel like it's not just, oh, I attend the workshop, now I'm anti-racist, but it's an ongoing process. So in today's workshop, you're going to learn about the profession's relationship with systemic structural oppression. We'll talk a little bit about critical race theory, especially as it's become kind of a hot topic on the national news front. And I'm really excited about the third aspect of the workshop, which is how to conduct a cultural audit of your library, which I think will be really helpful for all of us at our institutions. So again, thank you for attending, and now I'm going to hand it over to Megan.
Holly, can you go to the next slide?
There we go.
Awesome. All right. So good morning, everybody. And in the chat, I would like you to answer the question on the screen. So what words come to mind when thinking about the library, but don't press enter just yet. I want to give folks a chance to type it in, and then this is called a chat waterfall, and it'll all come in at once when I tell you to press enter. So I hope you're writing a couple words right now in the chat, and make sure that you have the answers to everyone so that we can all see it and not just like me. And I think on your mark, get set, enter. That's probably a little too much for this morning without enough coffee. So I hope I've woken everybody up now. So we've got some great answers. We've got privilege and information, egalitarian, accessible, social, books, access, equal access, work, underutilized, awesome, resources, collaboration, information, knowledge, exploration, welcoming, assistance, safety, access, eliminating barriers, more work to do, and help. Awesome. So I want you to keep those words in mind as Holly is going to take over and talk to us about the systemic oppression.
All right, thanks, Megan. Yeah, so as Megan said, right, keeping those words in mind, because I'm going to be your little douse of cold water first thing in the morning. The first thing that we want to sort of look at, right, if we're going to talk about structural oppression and how the library fits into it, is sort of the ways that libraries aren't necessarily living up to some of our higher ideals. So I wanted to just kind of start my section of this presentation with this quote that I first encountered when I was in library school, reading John Bushman's book, Dismantling the Public Sphere, about academic librarianship. And he opens with it saying, it's almost cliche to say that librarianship does not exist in a vacuum. Nevertheless, it is a cliche we in the field seem to forget, and often. And I think when I was in my graduate program, I was like, well, yeah, of course. But I can appreciate this quote a little bit more now that I'm a librarian who like never leaves the library. And when I do, my coworkers on the college campus are like, oh, they let you out today, huh? That, you know, in this profession, our daily lives are so enmeshed in library things. And I don't think that we are as strong as making connections to the culture and society that libraries are operating in. And so we developed this kind of blind spot about how libraries relate to some of the larger cultural things that are going on. And so, right, I think an idea to start with is this one, right? That if there's structural inequality in society, or social inequity, right? Then there's going to be structural inequity and inequality in libraries. Libraries are they're institutions, right? That are perpetuated and operated by people who make policies. And as you know, librarians are humans, and as humans, we're social creatures who learn from each other and from our environment. So we can't look at the world around us and say everything's in flames, but libraries are perfectly fine, right? This sort of if-then logic here is if society is racist, that's going to be part of libraries as well. But I also want to sort of start our cold douse of water first thing in the morning with perhaps a gentler thought too, which is structural inequity, right? Systemic racism, structural oppression is not a personal failing of any individual, right? This is a collective thing, and it's also something that we've inherited. So no one individually is propping up this whole system. But that being said, we do have a personal, and when we think about libraries, a professional responsibility to do what we can in our field and be knowledgeable about how we are contributing or helping to dismantle a society that is unequal. So, you know, I had a great professor when I was an undergrad who would always say, it's not your fault, right? It's not your fault that the world is super racist, but now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Okay, so when we first sort of came up with this presentation, one of the ideas was doing sort of a history and looking into the history of oppression and racism in libraries. And I started doing that. And as you would imagine, any kind of history is far beyond the scope of the 20 minutes I have allotted to me. And it's really beyond the scope of this whole sort of conference session, right? So I'm not going to be giving a history, right, of libraries or a history of racism in libraries, but I did this kind of exercise for myself. As I was thinking through, okay, how do I want to present this? How do I want to think through this? And what I kind of came up with was a timeline where I tried to sort of contextualize the history that we might be kind of familiar with in libraries within American history, right? And so I'm actually going to, I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna pull this up. I've already pulled it up ahead of time. But I would invite you to sort of look at this later on, because again, we're not gonna be able to even go through this entire timeline. But I want to sort of use it to point out a few things and ground us in what it means to think about the library in American history. Because I think Megan and I were talking the other day, and our experience in library school was, right, the first day of the semester, you get the presentation that was the history of public libraries, the history of cataloging, the history of digital humanities. But it would always be very much focused on just the library aspect of it and not really understanding maybe where that was taking place against the backdrop of what was happening across America. So that's kind of what I want to just take a few minutes to look at with this timeline. So I want to start out by just kind of looking at our library, right? The big moments, the landmark moments in library history. So I'm going to go kind of down to the bottom here because I have this sort of moving backwards. What's the first thing that we think about with American history and libraries? Well, we have the founding of the Library of Congress, right? There's kind of a whole story with the founding of the Library of Congress, but essentially where it really picks up is there was a small collection of books that were destroyed during the War of 1812 by the British. And so then Thomas Jefferson offers to sell his entire personal collection to Congress in 1814, actually. I have the date wrong here, strong start. And that becomes sort of the founding collection of the Library of Congress. Now, I won't go into this too much, but it doesn't take a lot of Googling to figure out Thomas Jefferson, quite racist, right? So library history starts with this really fraught sort of duality where Thomas Jefferson gives this collection of books and it starts this revered institution profession, but he was active in the oppression and continuation of slavery. Okay, so Library of Congress. I'm going to jump forward a little bit. And we're going to look next at the founding of the ALA. So in 1853, there was sort of initial looks at founding a library organization, and then it didn't actually happen until a bit later, right? What happened in the middle? Oh, the Civil War. So the founding of the ALA comes later, but there was already a group of librarians in 1853 thinking about doing this. But I want to kind of look at this, right? 1853 is 3 years after the Fugitive Slave Act, which was the legislation that said, you know, if a person of color was found someplace, and even if they were free, they could be dragged back into slavery. That was the Fugitive Slave Act. So again, we have this kind of these two different worlds that we can see right next to each other. And so the people who were meeting to form a permanent library organization was not diverse, it was not representative, right? These are mostly all white men. So we then have the founding of ALA in 1876. And again, right, we are zooming through some major events here, but this is just over, right, 10 years after the end of the Civil War. And with the end of the Civil War came sort of the Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, which ended slavery, made former slave citizens, and granted the right to vote on paper, right? But as we know, this is an ongoing battle today. But the same year that we have the founding of the ALA was the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this is happening in the midst of what's kind of now referred to, and I do French history, so I don't know American history as well, but this is in the middle of the American Indian Wars, where it's basically like the federal government and Native peoples are clashing over Native peoples' rights to the land that is theirs. And that's happening the same year the ALA is founded. So another person in library history that we like to hear about is Andrew Carnegie. So his first public library in America is built in 1885. And this is happening, right? This is the year before the Seattle riots, which I don't know a whole lot about, but the Seattle riots were fueled by anti-Chinese sentiment that was kind of grown out of the Transcontinental Railroad. The same year, there's also the Carrollton Massacre, another thing I don't know a whole lot about, but there were 20 African Americans killed in Mississippi, right? So this is happening at the same time that Andrew Carnegie, the bastion of libraries, built his first kind of institution. And I went to school, undergrad in Pittsburgh, and so I always am interested too to look at Andrew Carnegie. We think of as kind of a hero of library history, but a few years after his library philanthropy work starts, were the Homestead strikes in Pittsburgh, where the Carnegie steelworkers were basically fighting for better working conditions and workers' rights against Andrew Carnegie. We also look at the first library program, right? And so the first library program opened at Columbia University in 1887. And again, this is right around the same time as these other really problematic events. And have to keep in mind, right, Columbia University's program was sort of a project of Melville Dewey's, who is another very problematic historical figure in libraries. So this is some of our big things, right? Library of Congress, American Library Association, first library school. And then if we move ahead a little bit, in 1911, we have our first woman elected ALA president, but notice this is 9 years before women can even vote. And then we'll sort of keep moving forward in time. This I thought was kind of interesting. So we've heard, I think recently, more about the Tulsa race massacre. That same year, there was a roundtable at ALA that was meeting to discuss diversity, which of course was all white roundtable members who were discussing it. And then actually nothing really, this roundtable was disbanded 2 years later because no one could really make any progress because there was a lot of tension between the North and South. We have a few others. I think this was a really interesting one to me, the ALA conference in Richmond, Virginia. Black librarians were invited to attend, but did not know ahead of time that they would not be allowed access to any of the conference venues because of Virginia's segregation laws. And then just around the same time, right? So we're very heavy into a time when a lot of states had their own segregation laws. The American Library Association adopted the Library Bill of Rights, which is a great sounding document. But 2 months later, 5 Black teenagers were arrested and put in jail because they were conducting a sit-in in an all-white library. So there's, kind of tensions throughout that we can see happening between what the library is saying it's doing and the history that maybe we are familiar with, and then what's actually happening in American history at large. So I wanted to sort of quick zoom forward a little bit, right? A few other landmarks. Brown versus Board of Education. This was a Supreme Court case that finally ruled separate is not equal in terms of education. Throughout the sort of 50s and 60s, there continued to be, forced integration and sit-ins of libraries and schools. And then we have a few really important civil rights acts. And the one that I wanted to just note here is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was the one signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson after the assassination of JFK. And this was, this came out of, if we look just the past year, the bombing in Birmingham, the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King did his I Have a Dream speech, right? So there were major events from the civil rights movement happening just prior to this. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 tried to set up things to support, like giving people more access to voting, making sure the institutions were integrated. But also in 1964, the ALA passed a motion honoring the Mississippi Library Association for its National Library Week activities, even though Mississippi withdrew its ALA membership because it would not permit membership to Black librarians. So even though they were not technically members, they were honored because of their National Library Week activities, but they were also being super racist. So we're sort of still moving forward, right? We have the formation of the Black Caucus in 1970, and this kind of happens the same year. There's a National Education Association Commission look at the ways schools are still very segregated. And, my research fell apart a little bit in more recent decades, but we can see there's this sort of trail that leads right to the present, right? And one of the interesting things I've seen that happens recently was the publishing of a resolution by the ALA that monetary library fines are a form of social inequity, and they're encouraging libraries to no longer charge them. So we can kind of see there's a lot of kind of problematic moments throughout the history, and taken together, I think it does sort of make the argument that library history reflects the sort of structural racism and oppression that we know is happening in other areas, but sort of tend to ignore in libraries. And part of this is what we would say in the past, right? It's in our history, but that it leads right up to the present, right? So when does history become the present? So I want to just take a few minutes though, because in the course of putting together this timeline, I trolled a lot of library institution websites and looked at their own histories. And this is where I think the sort of problems we have in the profession start to really come out. So for example, we've sort of looked at this timeline, right? I'm going to take a look at the Library of Congress. and they have a timeline of Library of Congress, right? So on their timeline, if we look at 1815, where Thomas Jefferson sells his personal library, right? Then that library actually gets destroyed in a fire a bit later on, 1851. And then 2 years later, the part of the library that's destroyed by a fire gets redesigned, newly remodeled. Fireproof iron room for the library opens. Now this is interesting, in the Capitol's west front. It is widely admired and becomes a tourist attraction, this new library room. But let's take a look back at the timeline, right? So in 1853, there's a new tourist attraction for the Library of Congress. In 1853, go down further. 1853 was 3 years after the Fugitive Slave Act. So who are the tourists that could have gone to that new room? There's a fair amount of people who were not being tourists at that time, right? So that's kind of one point where it's like, I don't see that anywhere on this timeline, right? So that's Library of Congress's timeline. I want to take a look at the ALA's timeline, because I think one thing that was interesting and really stood out to me on this timeline was the Library Bill of Rights, right? And so let's see, when did we say that was? That was in 1939. So if we go to the ALA's history in the 1930s, and we look at 1939, Library Bill of Rights is adopted. The structure of ALA has changed over time. There's information about the division structures, committees, working groups, roundtables, right? Okay. Nothing about this sort of problematic arrest of teenagers who did a sit in a library. And if I went to read more, nothing. And one other thing I wanted to take a look at is if we look at the diversity, right? So ALA's website also has this section about diversity. And this is the one that makes me laugh and cringe and cry all at once. Is if we look at their timeline in 1876, they say, working with people of all races and sexes has been a goal since early in ALA history. 13 of the original members present at the founding of ALA were women. Oh, there were some women. All right, that doesn't seem like enough. I'd like to read more. There's not much more, right? So this 1876, we have this on our timeline. And remembering, right, this is happening just over 10 years after the end of the Civil War. And yes, there were 13 women present, but there were 90 delegates. And also women weren't going to be able to vote for another 50 years, right? So I'm going to go back to our presentation now, and I'm so sorry to be zooming through this, right? But like, what's happening here, right? I think the timeline is interesting, but even more interesting, I think, is looking at the timelines in real time right now and being like, why is that history so poorly told, right? So I think this duality and the sort of structural problems and racism in history that we're seeing is the result of a lot of things, right? And the first is in librarianship, like our education, right? When were we taught this? When did we have a good history class in our MLIS programs? But I think part of that comes from the scope of the library field, right? We have a lot of components going on. Professional leadership, right? It's not really clear like who's setting the agenda and the norm for some of what we do. The MLS requirement becomes sort of a problem within all of this, especially based on what is required of accreditation. And we also have this tendency to have this vocational awe, right? Libraries are these wonderful places. We are great people. We give access to information, right? But when we sort of take a look at some of this, like the discrepancies between what we can see in history, but how we present ourselves on our association websites, we start to see this real divergence in sort of the rhetoric that we use and the reality. But right, libraries don't exist within a vacuum. So those are some of the problems within our profession, but this profession exists in these bigger systems that really challenge and make it difficult to do our work, you know, in an equitable way. So we have the sort of cultural structural oppression in society. We have sort of capitalism and neoliberalism that puts emphasis on sort of individuals and individual sort of responsibility. And that's kind of one of the reasons we feel sort of the guilt for this structural system, is because so much of our culture makes things the responsibility of individuals. And then also the challenges of globalism. And then all of these, you know, we also sort of turn back and see the relationship between this larger culture and library profession. And then we have these more sort of closer to home components. The challenges of information overload, teaching about misinformation, disinformation, right? Knowing this kind of digital divide exists, and the kind of attitudes that are being baked into algorithms. So these are all these big structures and systems that are impacting our profession and how we do our work. So, so what do we do, right? This can be really overwhelming, and it can be very sort of devastating, right? And it feels impossible. And I think we're kind of seeing the need for two things. The first is, like Brandon said at the beginning, we need some practical steps, right? We need some action items we can actually do. But we're also seeing the need for systemic change. And to do that systemic change, we have to be able to have a theoretical understanding of these structures. We also have to do outside of the box thinking to figure out how to change them. So for today, some of the answers that some of the tools we're trying to provide for you are critical race theory, is, you know, how to think about some of these things at sort of higher, more abstract level, and then also critical race pedagogy as a more specific way to take steps in our teaching to make more concrete changes. And then, of course, audits of our institution to see how some of these systems may be manifesting more locally. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Don, who is going to go more into critical race theory and pedagogy.
Holly, thank you so much. That was such an amazing introduction, because I think it gives a perspective on, first of all, like not only the timeline, but also the framework of the origin of not only librarianship, but how we look at history and we evaluate it and what we can do moving forward. And I think, again, this is a perfect segue to critical race theory and why it's very relevant today. Well, first and foremost, it is a very zesty, very spicy topic. When I mean spicy, I mean very controversial, only because it has been very relevant in the past several years, especially post-Trump presidency. And it's been really debated among conservatives and liberals back and forth. There have been a lot of stigmas that have been attached to critical race theory, especially as we look at its association to quote unquote wokeness, how it could be considered a very radical approach to education. But I think along with a lot of this rhetoric, a lot of the narratives that are being thrown out there, and almost for both sides, there is a slight spread of misinformation relative to critical race theory or any type of critical approach to education. And I think that critical race theory, as Holly pointed out, is integral for our profession, especially as we look at higher ed, as we look at librarianship in general, and as we look at our instructional framework. So what I want to do is to kind of highlight not only critical race theory, but I want to clear up any of the myths. I want to clear up or define critical race theory and other instructional practices that relate to it, and kind of bringing it all together and how it connects to us, our librarianship work, and how we can kind of move forward in a much more progressive way. So next slide, please. Thank you. So again, just to define critical race theory, it is, before I actually define it, critical race theory has been a while for quite some time. So in the 60s and 70s, a lot of scholars, a lot of higher ed educators, professors have been throwing this idea and concept around, but it was officially coined in 1989 at a critical race theory workshop. And essentially, even though this definition has evolved over time, the framework of critical race theory is interpreting laws and systems upholding and perpetuating inequality for traditionally marginalized communities. So again, the systems and institutional part is extremely important because it lays the foundation of everything that we see today. So an element of critical race theory is that it assesses race as a social construct and how it's kind of been integrated within our society and almost globally, and how it's been used as a social hierarchy oppressing people of color, and how it affects the different systems and what that looks like for those communities. So another point to critical race theory, this is according to Benilla Silva, is that it's embedded in the fabric of our country and is the byproduct of white supremacy and racial inequality. And that's the big thing, because I think there is this misconception that critical race theory is not only teaching this, but it's also teaching our students to have a side eye to white people as if it's a condemnation towards white people. And that's not the case at all. It's not saying that white people are inherently racist. The concept is that systems in our country specifically are inherently racist, as Holly beautifully mentioned in the timeline. All of the systems that we're assessing have come from a place like chattel slavery, Black codes, Jim Crow, which then leads to redlining, academic inequity, and in different facets of society, which creates social inequity, it creates academic inequity, and this also is tied into librarianship. So as we're talking about how we kind of view our role in librarianship, and we also kind of look at the timeline, we must have a very sober mind. We must have a very sober kind of perspective on where all of this began, because looking at the origin of our history and understanding how this affects our day to day, we are light years ahead of where we were in the late 1800s, right? But at the same time, archaic practices die extremely slowly, and we see the remnants of that. So critical race theory, again, kind of looks at it from this perspective. And this is why it matters, because evaluating the role of race and racism in all facets of societal systems can give us a better perspective on education, how we look at the framework of teaching, and librarianship. The history tells us the story, and the story allows us to make more informed decisions in order to make the systemic changes that can only better ourselves as professionals and our libraries moving forward. And again, it's acknowledging racism as an embedded feature, something that is integral within systems and institutions. But not only is it embedded, but it perpetuates racial inequality that might not affect even the pedestrian person of color, but depending on the conditions, depending on the community, it does. So there's remnants of that have to be acknowledged, because we see it today, even in the wake of George Floyd, and how police brutality, and how even COVID within the medical health field, how there are just these systems that are still relevant in terms of its systemic oppression, in terms of its systemic effect on communities that are less privileged, and particularly people of color. And to kind of encompass this, it's embracing this historical perspective as we look at how we can change it from a contemporary progressive point of view, and how we can uplift a lot of these marginalized communities so we can balance that equity, so everyone is receiving the same thing at the same time, especially as we look at librarianship and just being honest with how there are deeply rooted issues within our own institution, but keeping the state of mind that we can do much more moving forward so we can have a better future for librarians moving forward, especially as we look at what we teach to our students. Next slide. All right. With all that being said, there is a huge pushback. So again, this is a debated topic, and it's not only critical race theory, but a lot of it is anything related to teachings relevant to racism, teachings relevant to slavery and what that looks like. The 1619 Project was a huge success in most fields of not only education, but just communities in general, because there are now currently 21 conservative-led states that have not only prohibited critical race theory in education, but they have pushed back on a lot of the 1619 Project type of educational practices, right? So anything that relates to critically looking at history in their schools, particularly K through 12, specifically high school and in higher ed, which is telling because there's this deep systemic fear, especially as what we know through post-Trump presidency. There is this doubling down on a lot of conservative ideals, but it's also a radical perspective only because you have a lot of pushed narratives like the 1776 Commission, which literally took a very skewed approach of our history, looking at our cultural roots and pushing a more patriotic narrative. But because of that, unfortunately, it leads to the whitewashing of history, and it also leads to the almost transfixing history and what that looks like. So again, just to tie this back to librarianship, Holly pointed out something very, very important. When we're looking at our own foundations of information, looking at the ALA website and looking at the timeline, there's some stuff that is missing. And not saying it's intentional, but it's almost as if we need to take a more critical lens on what we're doing. So as we're looking at critical race theory, and as we're looking at where it is today, I think it's very important to heighten our critical consciousness, our critical perspective, and how we critically, as you could tell, critical is like the biggest term right now, critically assess information, history, and our framework of giving all of this to our students, to our libraries, and our colleagues as we look at our profession today. So next slide, please. All right, so let's first take a look at critical pedagogy, because I'm not gonna lie, Holly's rendition was almost like an example of a critical pedagogical lesson, right? So it's an educational approach to helping students achieve critical consciousness. And essentially that's encouraging students to be a skeptic, right? As we try to do with, as librarians, teaching students to evaluate information. But in this case, it's evaluating and assessing critically power structures that are oppressive, and critically evaluating societal ideologies through institutional inequalities. And we're looking at the philosophical approach also to education, looking at it through a lens of not just giving information to students, but encouraging them to look through the information for what it is. So it's looking beyond on what the author is just saying, but it's looking at the author in itself and that person's credibility, so you can you can evaluate and assess the information in from a different perspective, from a more critical lens. And again, it's challenging students to examine the power structures and status quo through an academic lens. So as we look at the Venn diagram, the critical pedagogy Venn diagram, the agency is encouraging students to act on the information that they're being accessed to. This is not then connected to social justice, only because with critical pedagogy, we're encouraging them to become active citizens in their government, in their almost social communities, so they can create this change, but they're also doing it from a position of looking at things through power and privilege, because that is the root issue of many of the systems that we are experiencing today, because that's how it was established way back when. And we have no control over the past, but we can evaluate the past and make a difference for the future. Next slide, please. So just want to kind of highlight, we'll give a huge shout out to Paulo Friday, who is, to me considered like the godfather of critical pedagogy. And he was a Brazilian educator during the 50s and 60s. And Brazil at the time was an authoritarian government, and a lot of the darker skinned / indigenous people were being oppressed. And they were very illiterate in many ways, so their understanding of what was going on in their society at that time was very skewed. So they were kind of just doing their role as laborers and as people who are on the bottom of the totem pole. But what Paulo Freire did, he took a to see, to analyze, and to act approach to education, which is essentially to see what is going on, why am I in the conditions today, is to analyze those conditions, and to act in order to make that situation that much better. So not only you're uplifting yourself, but you're uplifting your community. So a quote that I kind of take from his work, his text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which highlights all of these things, is looking at the past must only be a means of understanding more clearly what and who they are, so that they can more wisely build the future. And what he established is that education is political. And he associates that political drive in order to encourage students to critically think and to critically act in order to kind of reform or amend anything that is, that lacks equity, which then can create systemic change, which ultimately builds an even platform for all people. So in a way, when we're looking at critical pedagogy, as we're looking at critical race theory, it's not like in the classroom, we're just telling them to, okay, I just gave you this lesson plan, now I want you to go out there and be somebody. It's not necessarily doing it through that lens, but there is a perspective where in a very sobering way, you're discussing the very real issues of a lot of our historical past, right? Everything that happened in the past and how it affects our future, but the simple ways that you can make that change, but to also know and understand and to acknowledge it, not through a condemnation perspective, but a very sobering perspective. So you know how to navigate, not only in your social circles, but through an academic way moving forward. Now, we talked about critical race theory. We talked about critical pedagogy. Now, Holly, if you don't mind, next slide. We are going to connect all of this to our profession. And many of us librarians have information literacy as an integral part of our profession. So with information literacy and what we do in the classroom as a one-shot, critical information literacy is tied into a lot of the things that we're discussing, but it's a way that we're thinking and teaching that examines the social construction and political dimensions of libraries and information, problematizing information's production and use so that library users may think critically about such forces. So essentially, doing everything that we kind of just highlighted, but through our lens as librarians, looking at information critically. So yes, we have the CRAP method. We have a lot of evaluating sources that guide our students to just be more responsible, people of knowledge and just students of higher ed. But it's to go through those lesson plans in a way where now it's not just evaluating a source, whether it's good for your assignment or not, but it's also critically looking at information where you're digging deep into the roots of not only the author, but the publisher and how that ties in to you as a person. And again, the overall structure of society and looking at institutions from a much more, from a critical lens. So next slide, please. And again, this adopts many elements of critical pedagogy. It's empowering students to recognize a lot of these oppressive institutions, building critical consciousness. So understanding what information privilege is. Also understanding how search engines might have an implicit bias. Also understanding how academic databases that we teach students have historically and arguably currently, they practice a lot of these implicit bias like methods, and knowing that, acknowledging it, but acting upon it, right? And this also expands our instruction and functions of academic librarianship. So if you don't mind, Holly, going to the next slide, thank you. We are looking at a diagram that is involved. Well, it's a diagram that represents cultural competency and building to cultural competency, which is extracted from instruction in libraries and information centers. So Laura Sanders and Melissa Wong created this text, and they incorporate a lot of different things that we can do better as librarians in order to build towards critical information literacy, not only for instruction, but librarians in general. So it's building, we're using this cultural intelligence model to build cultural competency, allowing us to reflect on our cultural competence, either in general or within different demographics. So what does that really mean? Well, we have to have the drive in order to make that change and to learn more about different cultures outside of our own. Then we have to accrue that knowledge and then apply it to a strategy where we can put it into action. And I am going to conclude only because we only have a certain amount of time, but I will pass the floor to Brandon only because we will go into discussion questions. But with this diagram in particular, this highlights the ways in which we can be much more progressive, not only as librarians, but as educators in the classroom. So Brandon, I want to pass the floor to you so you can go into discussion questions.
Okay, thank you, Don. So, we've had a lot of information, and this is kind of, as we've been trying to work on how do we get towards this practical, hands-on approach to, critical information literacy, this is kind of the barrier we've run into, because it's like we have to educate ourselves on the history, on the theory, to really get at the core. We can't just say, okay, well, here's a worksheet and this is how you do it at the end. Like, you have to be invested in this to make it work. And so Holly, can you pull up the Google Doc and also put a link in the chat? So we know we've been giving you a lot of presentation, so we're going to kind of move towards a few minutes of giving you some time to reflect. And Holly will be putting the link in the chat to this Google document. But what we really want you to do is think about this idea of cultural competency, which Don started talking about right at the end of his slides. And this will, is completely anonymous, but we just want to have you thinking about some of these initial ideas and thinking about, how would you actually rate your own cultural competency? And again, this is anonymous, so you can be, vulnerable there, but also thinking about like what actually motivates you. And these are some of those key steps when, Don was sharing that last chart. This is really getting at kind of like what's your drive to start making this change. So you can just go in here, type in, you don't have to answer all of them, answer what you're comfortable with. But then what I'm hoping is after you reflect on this, maybe what we can do is have some folks share out some of their thoughts about just even thinking about these questions, because sometimes they can be a little uncomfortable for us. But I'll give folks a few minutes to do this. Yeah, it looks like the Google Doc, because we have such a large attendance, which is great, but it looks like it might be slowing the loading of the Google Doc. Kind of the, challenge of planning a workshop at 9 a.m. in the morning. We're like, is there going to be like 10 people or, 80 like there is now? So.
I'm looking at the Google Doc, and I want to say thank you to everybody who has shared some really vulnerable things and for participating. It's almost 10 o'clock at this point, but I just, I don't know, my heart's just like full of gratitude right now for you guys to be so vulnerable and to participate in this way. And so I just really, really appreciative to you all.
Yeah, as I'm seeing people write down, was particularly, as my job is mostly instruction, but question 5, what strategies would you use to plan and deliver instruction? I think that's one where sometimes it feels like, well, what can we do about it? Because it's like, we all have that experience where you get asked to visit a class and the professor wants you to cover everything under the sun in 50 minutes. And so this is really kind of, the question that I think was the driving force of Silk this past year. I'm like, well, how do we do it? It's like, yeah, it's like, there's critiques of our evaluation systems, like the CRAP test and stuff, because we know it's not perfect. But also it's like, how do we, we use it because we don't have the time, right? Or, we don't have enough time, both physically in the session, but, some of these things you can't necessarily teach a student how to think. We can give them tools to think critically, but then we can't reinforce it very often over time. But I'm really liking some of these ideas, like somebody mentioned, balancing class time by employing flip strategies for skills that focus on hands-on application. And I think that's as an advocate of active learning, I think that, that really appeals to me. But I really think, and I like the component that they added of adding critical appraisal of open discussion. And I think that's something where if we, stick to more of our, show and tell model of demoing, that's not really as capable to really get into a deeper critical conversation. I'm seeing, and I'd like just to echo what Megan had said, and it's like, you guys are here. I'm very, humbled by everything that you're sharing. That's so vulnerable.
Brandon, if I could, I just want to chime in because you said something that set off alarm bells for me, right? Is this idea of not having enough time either to work with students or just kind of in our own professional experience. And and that's systemic as well, right? That it's like there isn't enough money given to our institutions, given to our departments to hire the kind of staffing we need. And that's true for so many of these student-facing fields. And that's not, that's systemic. And so that's part of where the practical and systemic start to butt up against each other in particular with what we're able to do with the time that we have, with the resources that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I feel like there's a lot of, I'm thinking of you in particular, Holly. When I first met you, you're like, I was like, well, how much do you all teach? And you're like, oh, 80 to 100 classes a semester. And I'm like, what? But you're like one of, a couple people who actually teach at your institution. And even at Geneseo, you're talking about resources. Like when I started working at Geneseo in 2015, there were about 9 people who are actually involved in instruction. And over time, I've basically been told to be thankful that I have 6 people who are reference and instruction librarians, and we do all the instruction and all the reference at there. And it's like, okay, well, yes, we can kind of stay afloat, but at the same time, it's like, it makes it much harder to try to have time to reflect and really invest ourselves deeply in thinking more deeply about these things.
And just for a note, the 80 to 100, it's probably more like in a year, not a semester. I'm saying this because also my library director's on, and I know she's like, let me look at these stats.
Either way, that's still a lot for one person over the course of a year. Logan just shared a link to a sidecar tutorial, and I have actually used that with some students because he shared it in one of our Silk community conversations, and that's a really good exercise for teaching students like how to evaluate a source and really interrogate one. And it's open so you don't have to like sign up for an account or anything. But I just wanted, before we transition over to Fatoma's presentation, I was just wondering if anybody wanted to share out any thoughts that they have from anything that they've heard this morning so far, or from reflecting on these questions. And you can either, talk out loud or put it in the chat, or we can just move on.
I'd like to speak.
Okay.
Okay. When it comes to cultural competency in the classroom and addressing it, honestly, I feel like I'm something of a beginner, so it's like I feel this sort of urge whenever I try to create something that addresses it, is to see like, okay, I need someone who's an expert. Who's an expert on this? And of course the answer is always no one. Like, okay, who's somebody I can go to who's older than me at least, who can look at this and tell me if I'm making an ass of myself in front of these kids. It's like, so I feel that constant urge is like to do that whenever I try to attempt something like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. And we have kind of that, well, there's a lot of things that can fuel our insecurity as instructors, but I know one of the things I hear all the time, librarians I've observed have a tendency to want to be perfectionist. And it's like, well, if I can't be have a perfect framework of how to address cultural competency, then I won't do it. And I think, you brought up a very good point. Like, yeah, we want to turn to people who are experts, but also what we need to do in this, because of the issues or systemic issues in our libraries, it's like we have to just start by putting a good foot forward and kind of earning our expertise over time rather than waiting to have the expertise.
Yeah, it's like just yesterday, it's like I was in a group where we were discussing like how to create a diverse collection, and we realized there isn't the metadata for that, let alone the best practices on how to do it. It's like, well, how do you know if it's like a book, for example, has proper representation of Muslim individuals? Well, you're going to have to open the book and look through it. That's the only way to know. There isn't a lot of lists that give like good information that say, okay, it's like these books, it's like show Muslim children, these ones show Muslim teenagers, these ones show Muslim Americans, these ones show Muslim individuals. It's like outside of America, so you can have a proper variety of books. It's like you kind of have to build the boat as you're sailing it, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, no, that's a good analogy. And I think that's what makes it so scary too and hard. Because, one of the things is, well, even if I have to build the boat, it takes time to build the boat, and I might have, 10 minutes. So, this is one of the challenges, one of the ongoing challenges. And I think this is also why we need to keep, talking about this as a profession and using our venues like the SUNYLA community conversations to keep talking about this, because it's hard. It's really hard. And, and especially in a profession where we love like the, quick fix, here's a worksheet to address it. Like, I would love that. Like, that'd be my dream, to have like a toolkit of here's what you need to do to be a critical instructor. But, as we are finding out, it's much more complex than that.
One thing that I think Allison mentioned, though, that I think is worth remembering, right, is like asking like, who's the expert on this? And there's no experts. But I would sort of suggest, right, thinking that's where, right, of not thinking about the library in a vacuum. Yes, our work is different than other fields, but there are experts in pedagogy, in critical race theory, in thinking about these things differently. They just might not be in the library world. And so the work is connecting with them and then relating their expertise and the knowledge they can impart to us into our discipline. And I think that's kind of a relationship building that we haven't really gone full throttle on yet.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for everyone for taking time to kind of reflect on that. Give us a little breather from the presentation, but we're gonna hop back in, and I'm gonna let Fatoma Rad from Farmingdale. Sorry, Long Island, SUNY.
It's okay, Long Island's fine, Brandon. So yes, thank you all for participating in that exercise. We're going to move on to the final section, which is conducting a cultural audit of your library. Next slide, please. So a cultural audit is a way to evaluate all the areas of your organization, or in our cases, our libraries, to see how diverse viewpoints are incorporated into everyday activities, everyday roles, or even just our everyday actions. So before I go on, I want to point out that I actually use a K-12 model, and I've adopted it for academic libraries. There's a bunch of different cultural audits out there. And now, just because of the times, you can find anti-racism audits as well as DEI audits. So you can definitely branch out and also contact professionals in the field as well. Next slide, please. So you want to take the time to audit your spaces so you can see how it's impacting your students, your faculty, your staff, and of course, what's often overlooked, your own library workers as well. These audits can be done yearly. You can have scheduled check-ins. You can throw them into your yearly planning, or you can do them as a way to help your library start creating goals that you're working towards. We talked about creating an anti-racist classroom, but in order to do that, you need to take a holistic approach. So you should take a look at your whole library and see how the whole library can support that. Next slide, please. So what areas should you look at? Obviously all of it. So we're gonna start off with the physical collection as well as the digital space as well. So for starters, you should take a look at your physical collection and your digital collection. Just for reference, when I say physical, I mean both books and ebooks. Digital is everything on your library website. It's important for the collection to help the departments and programs on campus to be up to date for accreditation. That's usually what they expect of collection development, but you should be making sure that you're incorporating diverse authors, diverse researchers, and even diverse research topics. So is there material in there that's reflective of your student body? You want your students and your faculty and staff to be able to find material in there that they can relate to, or that at least represents them. And if you do have representative material, are you taking the time to make sure that's being shown or celebrated in some way? You also want to evaluate your library website, who is being displayed on the website, what material is being highlighted. And we need to remember not all of our students do come into the library. Some only end up on our website. So if they're on your site, what is your library page or pages telling them about the library? Do they see anything that may appeal to them or may reflect on them? So that's something you should definitely take into account. Next slide, please. So I want to highlight a few research guides. I'm going to start off with Binghamton University. They have an anti-racism research guide and resources. This guide alone shows the students that the library has resources for them in regards to anti-racism. They also have a land acknowledgement, which I really, really love. And the guide itself can be used for students and instructors. It has a breakdown of anti-racism resources, and then it's further broken down into subjects, and then it highlights anti-racism in higher ed, as well as decolonizing the syllabus. They also have an area which is really important for students where it celebrates Black voices. So this highlights titles in the collection, podcasts, and videos. Next slide, please. So Westchester Community College has a Juneteenth research guide, and many instructors and students, and I guess the overall population, don't even know what Juneteenth is. So this is a great way to just get a historical background, learn what it's about, and then within the guide, they also have definitions for systemic racism and microaggressions. Microaggressions are something that can be really hard to explain unless if you experienced it. There are faculty, staff, and our students who do experience it, and students especially, they can't really name it. So this guide has a great explanation for students, and it helps them learn how to name it and at least talk about it. And just having that in a guide lets them know that the library is aware of it and they can reach out to them. If not for more resources, it might create that safe space for them to ask for help as well. Next slide, please. Farmingdale has an anti-racism guide as well. So just like the other guides, we have resources, but the thing that I want to highlight in our guide, which we also did eventually for the AAPI guide, is that we have resources to help our students cope. So our students actually multiple times told myself, because I work for SGA, that they need mental health help. They're struggling and there was no help for them. So we have connections to on-campus mental health resources, but we also have off-campus resources for them, anonymous resources. Our campus, unfortunately, did not address the numerous AAPI hate crimes that happened. They addressed it at a much later time, and our SGA had asked us for help again. So we had created this guide for them, and they were able to send it to their clubs, their classmates, the student newspaper picked it up. So it was a great way for them to at least contact us and keep the information going for them. So LibGuides, or in my library's case, we use research guides, are a great way to help students and faculty to at least feel seen. And when they do see this, they do reach out, they do thank you, and they do ask you for follow-up questions. Next slide, please. And finally, we have Geneseo, and I like this guide a lot because it's clearly geared for instructors. They have resources that can be incorporated into the class. So even for librarians, when we're trying to figure out how do we add in these resources, this guide can help all of us. I like that they chose to incorporate professional development in here because that's a great way to have instructors or even staff to take an initiative to learn how to become anti-racist without putting all of that emotional labor on that one individual on campus or in the library or the specific group individuals who they always turn to. It can be really emotionally taxing and tiring. So it's helpful to have a guide like this to at least give them some steps that they can take on their own. If your library doesn't have any research guides or anything on their website that addresses any of these or touches any of these points, I highly recommend checking out these guides. They can give you enough to get started, or you can at least link them to these guides. Next slide, please. All right, so since we're waking you all up, you should be awake by now. We're gonna play bingo. So we're gonna drop the link in the chat. This bingo card is an adaptation from Catherine Fishman Weaver. She uses this for K-12 classes. She evaluates the books that are in the classrooms to make sure that they're reflective of the students in the class as well as the students in the whole school. So using your own respective catalogs, take a few minutes to go through these. As you go through it, try to ask yourself if you're aware of all the acronyms. If you have any questions that come up, you can drop them in the chat or you can make note of them later. As you're searching the catalog, try to see what you're feeling. Do you have any concerns? So we'll give you all, let's say about 2 to 3 minutes. And then once you get bingo, drop it in the chat.
So Fatima, do you have any suggestions for how people should get started with this?
Yeah, so for starters, I would definitely make sure you're aware of all these acronyms. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, Person of Color. MENA stands for Middle Eastern, North African. SWANA, Southeast, Southwest Asian, North Asian, the entire Asian area. Trans authors, Black male authors, non-binary, gender non-conforming authors. AAPI is Asian American Pacific Islander.
And
so in a way it's, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So the goal is for them to search in the catalog for an example of each of these, right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, in a way it's going to force you all to.
Already got bingo.
Ooh, what campus is this?
SUNY Erie.
Ooh, go Carrie.
Also,
this is also where, so I'm tech services. This is where you really force all librarians to like learn how to use their catalog. Chloe got bingo, nice.
Yeah, I would say, you know, if you're interested in doing like some staff training around it, this could be a very kind of like eye-opening exercise, you know, and feel free to take the bingo board.
Yeah, definitely. If you only teach or only do IL classes, it's a great way to branch out to collection development. Ask them to help you find these titles, because while you're teaching and while you're talking to students, you want to be able to have titles that you can be able to call upon.
Looks
Logan
like,
got bingo.
Yeah, and so did Chloe, our super searchers.
Angela got bingo too. Awesome. Holly, could you switch back to the PowerPoint? Next slide. Okay, so the one thing I just want to highlight in case you're not aware of is everyone should be aware of how titles are added or removed to their collection. That's something that I kind of started when I came in, because there's always going to be titles in there that are actually problematic. So you should be in the business of checking out your catalog, seeing what gaps are there, what isn't there. And if you're aware of the protocol, it makes the conversations a little easier. Definitely take time to reach out either to collection development, acquisitions, keep all of that in mind. And if you see there's areas that you can add in that will help for your IL classes, you should definitely bring that up with your colleagues as well. Another thing is if you have BIPOC faculty members, try to keep up with what they're publishing and throw that in the collection. All faculty members want their stuff highlighted anyway, but oftentimes BIPOC faculty members are overlooked and their stuff can get neglected. So definitely make sure those are in the collection as well. So we're gonna move on. Next slide, please. So these are some titles from our library if you wanna copy any down. These are all pretty good titles to have. And this isn't a one and done deal. You should be doing this as often as possible. You want to have as many BIPOC authors. And the reason why I specified so specifically outside of BIPOC is because MENA, SWANA, AAPI, those are all just a few. You want to make sure everyone is represented in there and not just glossed over. And yes, again, the cataloging is super racist, but it's been, you know, kind of a thing that is being acknowledged in the field. I know there are a lot of catalogers who are trying to change that up. Next slide, please. So again, I use a K-12 model. It helps organize our library. It works well for me. There's tons of different audits you should check out. There are a few OERs as well that can help you with auditing your library. There are 10 areas that you can evaluate to see how your library is performing and what you can do to improve. So audits are a way to make changes, achieve your goals, or at least start setting goals to see how to change up your library. You can do this yearly, and it's okay to repeat them. In fact, you really should be repeating them. We work in higher ed, our students change all the time, so we should be adapting to the needs of our students. Next slide, please. All right, so a friendly reminder before you start auditing, the purpose of an audit isn't to point out all the problematic areas or issues and just not address it. You should look at each area critically, but you should think of a way it can be improved. This is definitely something that you have to do with great criticism, but also be kind to yourself. You want to approach this with constructive criticism and a constructive mindset. You also don't want to really demoralize everyone you work with and be like, well, our library is awful and we can't do anything and we're just going to leave it at that. Audits, just like we do evaluations for IL classes, they're going to show some gaps, and you just have to be committed and acknowledge that there's changes and needs for improvement. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through the 10 areas and show how you can audit a library. So shout out to my director who allowed me to audit our library. So you all will learn a lot about Greenlee Library today. I'm not going to do every single detail, but it's more of a sample to help you get started. The first thing you're going to start is your vision. And if you don't have a vision or a mission statement, I would definitely say stop and start there, because you're not going to know what your library is about if you don't have that written down. So at the moment, Greenlee Library does not state anything in their mission about anti-racism or working towards a diverse environment or none of that. What we do is we are umbrellaed under the campus mission statement. So that does include the commitment to inclusiveness, diversity, and then they expand it in their goals. I would like to add it in our library mission statement, so that could be something we could look over. And then the one thing you should remember is your vision and your goals is something that can be changed or edited. So that's something that you can always add in. If you need more ideas, I would definitely see like a Central Arkansas library system and Oakwood Public Library. They are super transparent, and they had like a really nice map out of how they took their steps. So yes, those are great examples to start off with. Next slide, please. So Greenlee doesn't offer any credit-bearing IL classes. Ours are all one-shot classes. So the librarians definitely work pretty collaboratively. We get feedback from each other, from professors, or see what a professor is like and how they teach their class, so we can try to accommodate them. I usually teach the first year experience classes and the English and Speech 101 classes for first year students. So I have more flexibility in how I teach, because I also incorporate just information about the library and how to use it. So when I teach them how to use the library, I definitely do my searches more strategically. I have BIPOC authors always there, titles, topics that are more underrepresented. I also want to emphasize that it's important to know who you're teaching with. You definitely get a vibe when you're teaching. So if the professor or instructor is very dismissive or makes you feel some type of way, you don't have to push back. I would make note of that professor, because chances are if you got that type of feeling, the students are definitely having an unsafe or unhealthy learning environment. Now that we're online, it's a little harder to create these safe spaces. So our head of instruction actually created norms for us that we share, which is helpful. We understand equity issues, so we let them know that they don't have to turn their cameras on if they're not comfortable with. We let them know that they must be respectful. And then we added that you need a neutral background when you're teaching, which became an issue a few times. If you need help about learning about just anti-racism tools that you can incorporate, this slide has some links. And I definitely encourage everyone to learn and support We Here, because they have something called community schools, and it's full of professional development opportunities based on anti-racism pedagogy. Next slide. So Greenlee has student employees. We sometimes get library graduate interns. We now have student involvement with SGA and a few clubs on campus. So take some time to see if the students that are involved in your library, are they a fair representation of the overall demographic of your campus? And are you creating proper leadership skills for them? We can help students find their voice in the library by letting them take on projects, encouraging them to learn about different topics as well. They then tell their classmates. We did collaboration with NAACP, SGA, campus newspaper, BSU. And when we worked with them, I gave them full control. So they made their own book display, they selected their own titles, I let them order material. We then had an event, we had a screening on campus with We Here, and then we had an exoneree talk as well at the library. So that definitely opened up the space for the students to realize that we're here for them, and they also have no problem now telling us exactly how they feel. So definitely try to do that and realize that there's a lot of space for you to be able to create opportunities for your students. Next slide. So our library is pretty small. We have 23 library workers total. So that's including our full-time and part-time librarians and our full-time part-time clerks. So of the 23 library workers, we only have 5 BIPOC individuals. Our library does not actively recruit or hire. So if that's different for your library, I would definitely take that into consideration. We can't actively recruit or hire, so that takes away us reaching out to underrepresented groups. And there's not going to be a new line added to us for probably never, honestly. So I can go on for days about the importance of representation, but I think a bigger discussion that our field now really needs to address is that we need to know how we're treating BIPOC workers once they enter into the library. So how are they treated in your library? Is it a space where they can be themselves, or are they being tone policed?
You're at the 5-minute mark.
Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to speed through. So the one thing I just want to emphasize is if your BIPOC individual workers are not safe in your library, you're not doing a proper job of helping the cause. Our head of IL is very open to feedback. So whenever I tell her that there are issues with certain instructors that I can't teach for, she doesn't brush it off, she doesn't laugh it off. If anyone in your library comes up to you and addresses these concerns, you shouldn't try to talk it down to them. You shouldn't tell them that maybe you should give them another chance. Definitely take the time to make sure that you're creating safe workspaces for BIPOC individuals. Next slide. So I can only talk on my teaching style. So again, as I mentioned, I highlight BIPOC search terms as to help the students, and you want to make sure that the databases you're using bring up the proper search terms. We all know about algorithms of oppression. Try to seek out databases that retrieve better results, and if they don't, you should definitely try to budget it or continuously pitch for it. If you have a population of ESL students on campus, see if you're addressing their needs. Our campus, something that has been brought up to me a lot is actually our faculty who are ESL. They have issues with their deans and their chairs because they're talked down to because of ESL. So we don't have that capacity, but it's something that I would like to see. If your library has that space and capacity, make sure that you're trying to address it either in your services or at least in your material. Next slide. So reaching out to different communities on campus and off campus can make a difference. There's actually a good amount of academic libraries that reach out to prisons or even social justice communities. Those are something that you can increase. You want to start those working relationships, and getting those working relationships will also make you stand up to the campus, and they'll not put a stop to adding more resources of such. It's all about branding, and we all know academia, it's literally just marketing and branding. So get in those outside organizations, and then also start that within on campus. So on campus, we're always with Multicultural or International Education Week, things like that. The more you get your name out there, the better it'll be. The Read Woke Challenge is a really easy way to start a book club and to get conversations going, or you can see if your students already have something on campus. Next slide. So conflict resolution is going to be different according to each campus. There might be issues with the topics you bring up or the titles you bring. In my case, sometimes it was the books I displayed, which I don't really care. But what you do want to do is make sure that you have the rules down. So make sure, are there any protocols that your library has if conflicts do come up? Our library is unique. We're really small. If there's a conflict, we usually contact our director. She takes care of it. As far as collection, that's me. And I have the rule that it's up to my discretion if I add or remove a title. And then if it goes beyond that, then I contact my director. And so make sure you're aware of the protocol. It's just helpful to have. Next slide. So the purpose of the whole audit is basically evaluating, assessing. Just like we do this for IL classes, you want to not stick it to just one department. It's not just info lit classes. You can assess all the areas: access services, collection, tech services. So try to do those check-ins. For me, collection development, each semester, I bring a group of faculty and we go through areas of the collection that I need to be looked at. They usually find titles that need to be added and removed. And I usually tell them that I want BIPOC authors and researchers, and they actually have been really helpful with filling in those gaps. Next slide. So Greenlee Library has no professional development opportunities for our staff. That's something that we've been aware of, and it was only changed during COVID because they were allowed to work from home. Now that they're all being forced back to come in person, we're trying to figure out how to slowly get that training or some form of professional development for them. So in tech services, we've been trying to change that for years. we're hoping that we can try to get an agreement between either the campus or our library where our clerks can continue to do that, because it definitely gives them a sense of empowerment and they enjoy it. Another gap we have is that we don't have any sensitivity or cultural bias training, and that's something the entire campus needs, but it isn't provided for everyone, and it's out of our control. Next slide, please. So we use book displays as a way to celebrate Heritage Months. Whatever students are, if they do research days or if they have big events, we display those as well. We don't do any programming and we have no budget. So we rely on the book displays and collaborating with other departments. Next slide. So we do not have time, but I'm gonna drop a link in the tab where you can at least practice doing the audit on your own. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. And yeah, 10:30 on the dot.
We are at time. I just want to remind folks that we do have the community hub. If you want to keep the conversation going, there's a spot there to talk about sessions afterwards, since we ran out of time for questions. So definitely go there if you have more questions for our presenters or just want to talk about today's session. And thanks to our presenters today for this wonderful workshop.
Yeah, thank you. I know we had a lot of content to go through. I'm really glad that the majority of you held on. I just shared a link in the chat to our LibGuide that has the slides as well as additional resources. And we're going to be sharing some of the additional resources that have been shared, or adding some of the resources that have been shared during this presentation. We'll also be sharing the link in other avenues. So if you miss it in the chat, just be on the lookout for it. But thank you, everybody, for attending our session today. And thank
Brandon, I'll post the link to the conference schedule.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Logan. And just thank you to everybody on the Silk committee. I work them very hard. We do a lot of work and projects. And like, I don't know, my mind is blown from the, what Holly, Don, and Fatoma presented today. And I'm just really thankful for everybody on the committee and their commitment to making us an active committee.